I would just like to start with a very short introduction to Children and Screens, the Institute of Digital Media and Child Development, which is an international, interdisciplinary nonprofit organization that I founded in 2013. Our message is to support and advance objective scientific research on the impact of technology on toddlers, children, and adolescents. And we accomplish this mission by funding research by top interdisciplinary experts, convening research conferences, retreats, and workshops, publishing in leading journals, and developing human capital in the field. We also educate and inform the public through media, workshops, panels like these, and we are a trusted resource for media, policymakers, and parents to learn and understand the evidence-based research on this urgent and complex issue. In fact, we have a film crew from France today, and they have I think they're the largest TV station in France and have what's akin to the 60 Minutes program there, and they are filming today. I'd like to say thanks to the following retreat sponsors, and I'm saying this to thank my husband, but it's the Stephen Della Pietra and Pamela Hurst-Della Pietra Family Foundation, the Rausch Foundation, Scott and Eileen Chen. Additional support was provided by Luis Alvarez Gomez, Deborah Klein Lowenthal, Maria Guter, Kimberly Paris, and Stony Brook University. Last but not least, I'd like to say a big thank you to the Wang Center, Stony Brook University, for allowing us to use this beautiful space to host our panel. And I'd also like to thank Madeline Petoskey and my staff and interns at the Institute. You're the best. Could you all wave? We've got a lot of them here. This special panel is part of a larger series of two-day international research retreats that Children and Screens started last year to focus multiple scientific disciplines on an urgent and a complex question of common concern. How is technology affecting children of all ages and families, and what can we do about it? Our hope is to elevate the field above philosophical debates and to use scientific rigor to inform policy and resource allocation. Last May, we held our first retreat to begin developing a screening toolkit which will help pediatricians and mental health professionals to identify and assess a variety of screen-related psychological and behavioral outcomes in children and adolescents. The toolkit will be used in research and clinical settings to help inform diagnosis and decision-making. Looking ahead, we will be hosting a digital media and mental health retreat in late September, to which you'll be invited to a panel. Another retreat to develop the screening toolkit further, and an emerging technologies retreat in the spring of 2021. Stay tuned. Following each retreat in the series, up to $100,000 in seed funding is given by Children and Screens to help researchers to pursue gathering of preliminary data for the development of research tools in order to help them to compete for larger awards from public and private sources. The impact of technology on the developing brain is only beginning to be understood. Tomorrow, more than 24 of the world's leading neuroscientists, imaging experts, neurobiologists, child psychiatrists, and government officials will spend 2 days exploring the cognitive, structural, functional, and molecular impacts of digital media, as well as the neurobiology of internet addiction here at Stony Brook University. Participants will discuss and report on state-of-the-art research and determine a future research agenda in each of these areas. So without further ado, please let me introduce our esteemed panel. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Anissa Abi-Dargham, the Lurie Endowed Chair in Psychiatry, Professor of Psychiatry and Radiology, and the Director of Multimodal Translational Imaging Lab, Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Psychiatry, and Associate Dean for Clinical and Translational Science at Stony Brook University's Renaissance School of Medicine. The panelists will be in order of where they'll be sitting. Dr. John Hutton, who's an attending physician in the Division of General and Community Pediatrics, the director of the Reading and Literacy Discovery Center. This is Dr. Abi-Dargham. Dr. John Hutton. He's also the director of the Reading and Literacy Discovery Center, affiliated faculty in Every Child Succeeds at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati Department of Pediatrics. Dr. Marc Potenza. He's professor of psychiatry in the Child Study Center of Neuroscience and director of the Center of Excellence in Gambling Research, director of the Yale Program for Research on Impulsivity and Impulse Control Disorders, and director of the Women and Addictive Disorders, Women's Health, Research at Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Martin Paulus. He is scientific director and president of the Laureate Institute for Brain Research, first from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Dr. Kara Bagot. Director, Addiction Institute at Mount Sinai Center on Addiction Alliance, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai.
Good evening. Thank you, Pam, for the introductions. And thank you for being this incredible force behind organizing this evening and the whole effort at looking at this very important, relevant, and timely issue. Pam's dedication is just amazing to me. I'm always in awe at her energy and resourcefulness. Okay, so without further ado, we're gonna start. So first was Dr. Hutton. So Dr. Hutton, in one of your recent studies, you have found that screen-based media use greater than recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines leads to decreased white matter integrity in preschoolers. That is obviously a very important finding. So can you briefly describe this study and tell us what it actually means? What are microstructural white matter integrity deficits indicative of? And what does it mean in terms of the function and long-term outcome, if possible?
Yes, that's a big question. So first of all, thanks to Pam for having us here. Thanks to Stony Brook for hosting this wonderful conference and everybody for being so brave coming out. So I am a pediatrician. I work with young kids. My wheelhouse is sort of 0 to 5, but mostly the 3 to 5-year-old age range, because in brain imaging, that's about as young as you're going to get to actually get them to sit still and do something and not scream at you and go running out of the room and bite you or anything like that. But anyway, so our study was conducted, we finished data collection about a year ago, and it involved a group of 47 preschool age kids, 3 to 5 years old. They were all healthy, normally developing, English speaking. And what we were interested in is the relationship between their sort of screen environment in early childhood and the structural development of their brain. We used a type of MRI called diffusion tensor imaging, which is a type of imaging that looks at the wiring of the brain, the white matter. And what white matter is it's essentially the wiring that connects the different parts of the brain into networks. And the reason it's white is it's coated with a fatty substance called myelin, which is sort of like the wiring in your house. It's got like a rubber coating on it that makes it conduct the signals more efficiently. So what we did is with these kids, we had them come in for a scanning visit, and we administered a survey to them. It was a new measure called the Screen Q, it was not one question about screen time, but it was actually a composite. The reason we did that is that the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines that came out in 2016 feature 4 aspects of screen use that are all considered to be important. One was access to screens. Where is the screen? Is it in the bedroom? Where is the child using it? Is it a tablet? Is it TV? What is it? There's frequency of use, which is how many hours per day, days per week, and how old the child when they started using. Content, was it fast-moving, slow-moving, educational, entertainment, violent or not, and then co-viewing. And so all these different items were resulted in a composite score. And we took that score as a predictor of the different measures of white matter development in the brain. And what we found was kids with higher scores on this survey and higher screen use, contrary to AAP guidelines at that age, had lower measures of white matter microstructural development. And what that means is probably a combination of organization of these fiber tracts, how well they're packed into bundles, and the coating of these bundles with myelin. Importantly with that, with any sort of brain imaging, you always want to have something to relate what you see in the pictures to. We also administered behavioral measures of language, vocabulary, speed of processing, which is a measure called rapid naming, and then literacy. And scores on all these measures for all these kids were also all significantly lower related to screen time. So we connected our findings in the structure of the brain with these behavioral measures, and so it seemed to suggest to us that at that age, and it's really the first to really look at that very young age of kids, there were significant differences in the structural development of their brain and tracks supporting these skills. And so we think, even though it's a correlational study, we think it's an important signal letting us know that something's probably going on at that age.
So basically, it may indicate that the information between brain regions is not traveling the way it would in subjects who are not using screen time as much.
Yeah, and the question that came up was, is there something damaging going on? Is there something about the screen that's harming the brains in some way? We don't really think that's what's going on. We think it's probably most related to, is there something displaced early in the childhood? Are these kids read to less often? Maybe they don't sleep as well. Maybe they don't go outside as much or kiss their dog or whatever. And actually, we followed this up with a study looking at reading time. This was published in January. And we looked at the amount of reading in the home in that same age and these same kids, and we found that kids that were read to more often had more access to books and things like that, had higher measures of structural brain development in tracks related to language and literacy, and also higher scores. And then we actually did a follow-up analysis where we actually controlled for the amount of reading time, and in the study of screen time, we found that the screen time effects still were significant, controlling for the reading time, although there were slight differences. Anyway, I guess what I'm getting at is that the reading aspect seems to benefit structural brain development. Screen time tends to be a negative in these studies in terms of structural brain development, but it's not completely either or. So there's probably a lot of other experiences that may be influenced.
So we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Dr. Potenza, you study internet gaming disorder, internet addiction. What is the World Health Organization's definition of that disorder? And is this a diagnosis that can be used for healthcare insurance reimbursement? Can you tell us about it?
Yes, those are great questions. As a psychiatrist, I do see people with these concerns, and being able to provide people the care that is important for their well-being is vital. So I've been involved in several efforts with the American Psychiatric Association, with the generation of the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM-5, as well as with the World Health Organization with respect to ICD-11, the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases. And so these are two of the main entities, volumes that define mental health disorders for DSM-5 and all health disorders in the case of ICD-11. And in the United States, as well as in other parts of the world, the ICD is used often for reimbursement for clinicians and other people who are providing care. So with respect to what happened in DSM-4 to DSM-5, in ICD-10 to ICD-11, there weren't any defined entities, diagnostic criteria for internet addiction or related disorders like internet gaming disorder or gaming disorder. And these were topics that were discussed by both groups, the DSM-5 group and the ICD-11 group. And going from DSM-4 to DSM-5, there were provisional diagnostic criteria introduced for internet gaming disorder. So the committee felt that there was accumulating evidence that this was an important concern, but they did not feel that at the time they had enough data to make it a formal diagnosis. With respect to going from ICD-10 to ICD-11, and this happened 5 or 6 years later, so more data had accumulated, the members of the group felt that enough data had been accumulated in order to define a diagnosis for a gaming disorder and put it into the official main text. And so gaming disorder, according to ICD-11, is defined by poor control over gaming behaviors, that there is increasing priority given to gaming over other activities, and that the gaming continues despite adverse consequences. Also importantly, there is impairment in one or more domains, be it schoolwork or social functioning or other areas. And so these are the main elements of gaming disorder as defined by ICD-11. Going from when will the United States adopt ICD-11? That will be several years down the road at the earliest. It took the United States a long time to move from ICD-9 to ICD-10, close to 2 decades after it had been, about 2 decades after
And
decade.
you would think any international influence is not welcome these days.
But I do hope that this will facilitate people coming forth, bringing people into clinical settings, because most people who are experiencing these problems don't at the current time receive care for them. And with respect to children and adolescents, the impact can be substantial, and it can veer developmental trajectories off course. And I think that this is important. I think it's also important to note that gaming is just one area of internet use. And you had mentioned internet addiction versus gaming. This was a topic that was discussed by both the DSM-5 and the WHO groups. And it was felt that the internet was more of a delivery device rather than the focus of the behavior. So having an entity that was defined as gaming disorder was felt to be the path to go to define the disorder. I think that more data for gaming arguably exists than for other types of internet use, but I think it's going to be very important to look at other types of internet use, social media use, pornography viewing. These are areas where youth as well as adults can develop problems, and it's going to be important for clinicians to have the appropriate information to help people with these concerns.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, this internet gaming addiction, is there like a certain age at which it could be detected, or how early has it, or was it figured in that study?
Yeah, so it depends on where you're looking. If you're looking in clinical samples, it tends to be in adolescents and young adults. However, the problems can exist at earlier ages into childhood. And there are oftentimes reports in the media of young children getting into oppositional behaviors with their parents or caregivers about the gaming behaviors when, for example, limits are set with respect to the time of gaming. There can be tantrums that are thrown or other...
And the younger, the worse, obviously. Okay, well, we'll get back to that. Now, Dr. Paulus, you were involved with the ABCD study, and you've published recently one of the most striking findings, which is looking at the brains of patients, the ones that were involved in screen and more activity and with screens and media, had premature cortical thinning. Do you mind explaining a little bit the ABCD study, the finding that you described? What are the implications of this finding? How do we understand it?
Well, again, thank you for for the organizers. I'm very excited to talk a little bit about what we've done and also give you sort of a background on the study. So the ABCD study is the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It's the largest study of its kind ever undertaken. It involves 11,000 children. They started, we as one of the 22 sites started recruiting these kids at the ages of 9 or 10. And our task is to follow them over the next 10 years to see what happens in their brains during the time of probably the most tremendous change that happens, that is adolescence. And so it's a very comprehensive study. It involves a lot of different measurements. And one of the measurements that we've taken is asked about screen media activity. And we've already heard a little bit about that. That involves quite a bit of different types of activities. You know, the questions that we're asking have to do with how much time you spend watching TV or watching videos, how much time you spend playing video games, but also how much time you text or you use social media, or how much time you engage in watching mature videos or playing mature video games. So, but these are really questionnaire data. So in other words, we ask these kids how much time they spend. We also ask the parents how much time overall they think their kids spend using screen media activity. And then what we did is, and at the same time, and this is what is part of the unique aspect of the study, these kids get to go into the MRI scanner. And the MRI scanner is a way, of course, of taking pictures of the brain, both structural pictures as well as functional pictures. And they do that every 2 years. So when we had access to the data, this is actually data that is made publicly available to researchers, so that lots of groups all over the country can actually acquire the data, learn about different aspects of brain development. So when we first had access to data, we had access to a subgroup of these kids, the first sample of these kids, which was about 4,500 kids. And what we were interested in, the basic question we wanted to ask, can we establish whether there is a relationship between the structural characteristics of the brain and how much screen media the kids say that they consume. And so we did some fancy statistical approaches to try to differentiate this and try to identify whether in fact there is a relationship. And lo and behold, we actually were able to find a relatively robust relationship. But I have to be very clear in terms of what the scope of what we were able to find is and what it is not. So what we found is an association. What that means is a correlation between one set of variables, the brain, and another set of variables, which is the screen media activity. And so what we found is that the kids that told us that they used a lot of screen media activity had, on average, thinner brains than the kids that said they did less so. So what's about thinner brains? What is that about? Well, we know that, and again, this is why ABCD is such an important study. We know that in the course of brain development, what happens is we actually lose neurons, nerve cells. That's a normal thing, and in fact, it's healthy. And what that translates to is that when we look at the gray matter, and we heard about the white matter just a little bit ago, which is the cabling of the brain. The gray matter is where the computations happen. So if we look at the gray matter, what we can actually see, there's normal, and I want to emphasize, normal shrinkage during adolescence. And that is, that's been well established. Lots of groups have worked on this. And so what we looked at, we asked the question, is there a relationship between the amount of gray matter and the cortical thickness to screen media activity? And what we found is, again, thinner and fewer gray matter. So what does this mean? What does this correspond to? Well, it looks like that the kids that were engaged in more screen media activity have brains that look like somewhat older kids, if you think about it. So, because if you think about that, the brain is losing some gray matter over time, and the ones that actually spend more time with screen media have slightly thinner and slightly fewer gray matter, then it looks like these kids have sort of somewhat older looking brain structures, or more mature looking brain structures. But again, the issue here, which is very important to consider, this was a cross-sectional study, meaning we only got data at one point in time. We're now beginning to look at the longitudinal data so that we can actually see what happens to a child or to now beginning adolescents as they're starting to increase their different types of media usage. So the other thing that we did is we then wanted to find out that there was a relationship between the screen media related brain differences and other function, like cognitive function, as well as what's called internalizing and externalizing behaviors. Internalizing behaviors usually behaviors that have to do with, feeling sad, anxious, not wanting to communicate with the outside world. Externalizing behavior usually refers to being more aggressive, being maybe temper tantrums and things of that nature. And so what we found that for most of these relationships, so we decomposed, again, we used some fancy statistical approaches, but we decomposed these relationships. For the main finding, we found actually relatively little relationship to these internalizing or externalizing behaviors. For some aspect of these relationships, we found that a slightly increased rate of externalizing with more screen media use. And so what we're now thinking is, yes, we can make the association between screen media and the brain, so there is a relationship. The precise nature of that relationship, we still have to do more studies on. And we can discuss that and talk a little bit about sort of the importance, but also the limitations of the study.
So it's obviously screen time is shaping the brain, and one way or the other. It's changing the white matter structure, the gray matter, decrease the pruning over time. Whether this is a good thing, possibly, or a bad thing. Obviously, there are some bad consequences. But this is something that we need to study. And that really takes me to Kara, Dr. Bagot. I wonder if you could kind of synthesize all this for us, because you've been studying what amount of screen time may be a good thing or a bad thing. What is safe, what is unsafe, what could increase vulnerability for addiction or other disorders. So can you comment on this?
Sure. So the easy answer is that we don't know, really. And part of it is the literature out there, and sort of what Martin alluded to with ABCD and things as well, is that a lot of the data, a lot of the science isn't that nuanced as of yet. So there are lots of different types of screen exposure, like we've heard, and all that may have differential sort of effects on brain development and behavior. Also thinking about things like passive screen exposure versus active screen exposure may also have differential effects. Things like co-viewing, right? So if your parents are with you and sort of interacting with you around screen exposure, that may have a different effect as opposed to just blankly staring at a screen. I think in sort of my area of interest and expertise is really around social media use, and looking at sort of how social media use may affect the brain of adolescents, and as well as the ABCD cohort, so younger children, like 9 to 10-ish. So we've seen with social media that we see a lot of this sort of brain activation in areas of the brain that are similar to what we see in substance use disorders, which is truly my area of expertise, is actually adolescent substance use disorders. So in looking and shifting focus to screen exposure, I've been really interested in looking at how social media like brain activation in relation to social media sort of overlaps with brain activation in response to use of substances in teenagers. And at least the early literature, and again, this is cross-sectional, this is not longitudinal data, like Martin was talking about, so we can't say that this is sort of the final definite say, or that these things, one leads to another, but it does seem that social media sort of activates the brain, the same regions of the brain, like reward regions of the brain, in ways that we see substances do that, so things like alcohol and cannabis and nicotine even. And that we see this mainly, the literature is mainly pretty robust in teenagers. And so that there may be evidence that this is an addictive behavior.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so we're gonna come back to you, and now what I would like to ask you about is to speculate about mechanisms for the white matter disturbances that you saw. And there could be two levels of mechanisms. I mean, addressing the behavioral mechanism, is it because, are the changes because those kids are engaging in this activity, or is it because they're not engaging in other activities that they should be engaging in? You know what I mean? Like what Dimitri calls the direct versus the indirect. But also the other mechanism I would like for you to maybe speculate about is at the neurobiological level. What could cause something like this? I mean, obviously these are quite drastic things to change. White matter, diffusivity and integrity. So can you enlighten us?
Well, I don't know about that, but you said that's a tall order. So there's a great maxim in neuroscience, and I did not make it up, that says neurons that fire together wire together. So essentially anything the brain is doing, the connections between the areas that are involved are going to be stimulated to become more efficient and faster. And that's where the myelin comes in, and the whole white matter being white comes in. So the more myelinated, the more coated, the more used these fibers are, the more efficient they get and the better. And that correlates with higher skills, whether it's kids practicing talking or kids practicing walking or kids practicing whatever. So anything a child practices doing, they're going to get better at, and the connections in their brain that are involved are going to be reinforced. So I think the findings that we had, and again, this is the little ones, this is the 3 to 5 year olds, and that's a very dynamic stage of brain development when things are really, really crackling, high plasticity. I think, I got a lot of questions about our study. Are you saying that screen time causes brain damage, or is this like radiation, or what is it? And it's really, there's nothing about our study that really suggests that. I think really the mechanisms at work are most likely involved with what sorts of activities were practiced in these kids and which ones weren't. And so I think if the white matter connections were less well developed in the kids with higher screen time, it was probably a result of less practice with something that in the kids that had less screen time was more practice, like talking to parents, reading, going out and playing, sleeping, whatever it is. So I think that really is probably the mechanism at work, because a concept in pediatrics is really important, is that children are not small grown-ups, and what they need in the world changes with age, and in the little ones, they really do need these human interactions. They need to practice language. They need to practice, using their hands and exploring their senses. And so I think, from my perspective, the reason that the white matter connections were less well developed in the kids with more screen time probably is a consequence of just less of that real world practice. And that was reinforced by our follow-up study with more reading exposure with kids, had better connected, better developed white matter tracks and higher skills. So.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna go over some of the questions from the audience, and they can be addressed. Most of them are addressed to any of you, so please feel free. This is a quick clarification, probably for you, Dr. Paulus. In the ABCD study, was there a relationship between mature screening time and increased shrinkage? I don't know what actually mature means. Does that mean porn or something?
Well, so when we asked the kids whether they watch videos they shouldn't be watching, right? So R-rated videos. You know, so it really refers to videos that are probably inappropriate and too advanced for the kids at age 9 to 10. So we looked at, we tried to identify were there differential relationships between different types of screen media activity. We did identify one factor that was more specific to social media related activities. Now I have to be careful here because at age 9 to 10, as you can imagine, at least in the cohort that we have studied so far, the engagement in social media is still somewhat limited. I mean, these kids are not going out there and being on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat, 24/7. Most of them use texting. Most of them use texting for getting in touch with friends, to go into activities. We actually did find that those kids who are doing more social media at that age are actually more physically active. And so the implication there is that, that actually helps them to connect to each other. But we did not find, so coming back to the question, we did not find a specific relationship between the structure of the brain and, say, mature video watching or mature video gaming. So we were not able to establish.
Okay, thank you. This is an interesting question about whether there are studies being done about the connection of children with screens and autism, ADHD, and oppositional defiant disorder. Any of you can jump in.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that with respect to, particularly with respect to gaming behaviors. There are links with ADHD and with transitions within problematic gaming behavior.
Right.
So ADHD is linked not only to problematic gaming, but also the persistence of problematic gaming.
Okay.
And this is something that we have also seen with other behavioral addictions like gambling problems, where there are similar links. With respect to autism spectrum disorders, pervasive developmental disorders, this whole cluster, my clinical impression is that youth and adults with these conditions may have difficulties with internet use, particularly within social domains. They may be attracted to engage in...
Over-relying.
Yes, but it may not understand the nuances of social interactions on...
But there are no good studies in this area?
I think it's an area that does need more investigation.
So whoever asks this question, that's something you can take on, right? We need more work. Anyone else who wants to make a comment? Okay. So as a future educator, I've been advised to use digital media and multimedia as much as possible, promoting engagement. Should the use of screen-based media be limited in the classroom? And if so, what should be the ideal screen time in an educational setting? Chiara, want to try?
Sure. That's a great question, and one that I struggle with myself with my own kids and their homework assignments that are very heavily screen time based. Again, I think it's really nuanced. Sorry. I think if it's interactive and kids aren't passively doing something, I think that does help. I think if educators and parents are sort of interacting with kids as they interact with screens, that helps as well. I agree that just from my own personal experience with my own children, but also working with educators in other schools, that using screens helps to get kids engaged in sort of academic activities. I don't know that I've personally seen any literature saying that there is X amount of time is a good amount of time, or X amount of exposure, or exposure for reading or writing or for math. One is better than the other. I think at this point people are trying and seeing what works for them. But I think the interaction, again, is a huge component, having the personal interaction and not having kids just like blankly staring at screens.
I just want to say, because we get these questions a lot, right? You want to say 4 hours and more is bad and less than 4 hours is good. I hate to tell you this, but all the data that we've looked at so far, and again, there's still a lot of caveats to say for that, we don't find this sudden transition where out of a sudden it's bad and then for the rest it's good. What we do see is that there's basically, most of the time, a quasi-linear relationship, which means that, yeah, a little bit more tends to be worse on some measures that we're taking, but one has to really look at this in the individual context. What we study, as looking at these large data sets, is giving you an overall idea whether there's a direction that things may be worse or maybe better. But again, I hate to say this, but there is no clear-cut number that I think and others probably would agree, beyond which you say, oh yeah, that is bad. I mean, it doesn't come up in the data like that. You would like to see that, okay, this is healthy and this is not healthy. But when we look at the data, we tend to see in these large data sets, we just tend to see sort of a line, and there's a lot of gray in the middle.
So that is really two really critical concepts with that question. One is the age of the child. I mean, you really have to think in terms of what does the child need at a particular age. Like the amount of screen time and what it's used for in a preschooler is very different from a sixth grader, is very different from a high schooler. The second question is, what do you want them to engage with? I mean, are they engaging with a math problem? Or are you wanting them to engage with other people? Are you wanting them to get used to engaging with a blank page and filling it with their own thoughts? Are you wanting them to engage with how to climb a tree or whatever? I mean, it's all very different. The concept of engagement and sort of interactive media comes up all the time, but really, a big issue with screen time is it's only really good at recreating certain things, and it's terrible at recreating other things. It's really good at recreating a video of Australia, but not so good at recreating an interaction with a person, like giving them a hug or whatever. But so anyway, that's my personal thought.
I would add the following,
Okay.
if I could.
Quick.
Okay.
It's a good question, by the way.
That it's really important to think about the types of screen time, not just the quantity of screen time, because there are significant differences with respect to spending 4 hours doing your homework versus 4 hours gaming or viewing pornography. And this also happens within school-based settings. Talking with teenagers that in computer labs, they may not be very well monitored, and they may be engaging in gaming or pornography viewing at school when they're to be doing their homework. So I think that this is an important area. If we get a better idea of what types of the types and patterns of screen time, it will help get the correlations more clear with respect to the positive and negative health.
Okay, so the good news is that we have a lot of questions. The bad news is that we may have to be here till midnight. We're not in any rush, right?
The rest can be multiple choice.
But so, I mean, this is kind of related. But somebody's asking, is what's important the time they spent or the content of whatever it is they're doing on the internet, or like seeing violent images? Can somebody speak to that? Quantity versus quality, or lack of quality or content?
I think that picks up where we were just discussing very nicely. And the type of screen time is very important to look at. People have looked at certain areas of correlations more closely than others. And you mentioned violence in video games. And there have been debates about the impact. And there, as people gather more data, it may be that certain groups of individuals may be more vulnerable than other groups, and understanding these individual differences is important. So a study that we recently published a few months ago was looking at this relationship between problematic gaming and aggressive behaviors. And it was really in the youth who were high in sensation seeking that you saw a more robust relationship. So understanding these individual differences in large samples, like the ABCD study, will provide greater clarity, I believe.
Okay. Related to all this, somebody's asking, are there studies about the correlation between screen time, brain development in young adults, not just very young children? It's probably somewhere between the two of you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I presume young adults means post-pubertal adolescents. And in terms of the brain studies, there's actually relatively limited information. There are a good number of survey studies that have done actually in adolescents. There's almost nothing that is done in the kinds of age groups that we work in, both Kara and I, working with the ABCD data. There are very few studies, brain studies, and no longitudinal study that I'm aware of, brain studies, that look specifically at screen media in the adolescent population. There's a recent paper, a recent manuscript publication that shows that over time that there is a change in physical activity that is related to changes in increase in screen media use. And again, coming back to what we were looking at, and I think that this is something that was pointed out by all of the participants, the brain is incredibly plastic, which means that it constantly changes. Your brain tomorrow is not going to be the same brain as today. And so as you engage in different activities, just like when you exercise your muscles will change. But as you do different things with the brain, your brain will change. So it is very likely that we're going to see structural brain changes at these late ages as well, but there's just not enough data at this point.
Okay, so here there are like lots of questions and hard to read, but one of them seems to be a little different from what we've been discussing so far, is there an effect on socializing and emotional development with this rapid rise of technology use? Somebody comment on this?
Yeah, so there's, I'll start. Okay. So there's, again, it's cross-sectional data, but there have been studies published by Jean Twenge and others looking at sort of screen exposure, again, all different types of screen exposure, so social media, internet use, gaming, everything, and effect on sort of social and emotional development in adolescence, particularly looking at like what Martin was talking about a little bit before, internalizing and externalizing disorders, so things like depression, anxiety, things like our kids doing the like developmentally appropriate, or teenagers doing developmentally appropriate things, like learning how to drive, for example, or like going to parties and hanging out with friends and engaging in sports. And so there seems to be a relationship between like sort of increasing screen time overall and sort of decreases in those like developmentally appropriate activities around like individuation, which is totally appropriate for adolescents. And it also seems to be related to higher rates of sort of depressive symptoms, anxiety-related symptoms and things like that. But again, this data is taken from like sort of cross-sectional cohorts and not longitudinal. But there does seem to be a relationship.
So as the ABCD study is completed, will there be opportunities to look at different time points and longitudinal changes in relationship to behavior?
I mean, in some ways, that is
That's the purpose.
the unique aspect of the ABCD study. Now, I want to say something else as well. So as we have done these, so ABCD is also a developing, it's a developing group. So when we first came out with some of these results, we then, and in collaboration with Kara and other people that are part of ABCD, we also realized that the field is changing so dramatically. You know, what was screen time 5 years ago is not what's screen time now. So for example, one of the areas that that was not covered even in the questionnaire that we asked at the, in the first wave were these multiplayer games. And these are massive. I mean, this has become a major source of activity, particularly among boys. And so we've actually modified and adjusted the questionnaire, now beginning to ask for these types of activities. I want to say one more thing, because it seems like people are really interested in the different types of screen media activity. Now, ABCD is a wonderful study, and we ask a lot of different questions, but we do exactly that, we ask questions. We already know from other smaller studies, and we're hoping that we can now expand this into ABCD, that what people say that they're doing is not necessarily what they actually are doing. The other thing I hate to tell you, by the way, since there are grown-up people in the room and not little people, we looked at the correlation between how much time the kids say they're spending on different activities and how much time the parents think they spend on the activity, and you can guess that correlation was actually really low. And so it was really low.
Was it overestimated?
Oh, the children were doing much more than the kids, than the parents were aware of. I mean, in general. But it also, but the correlation low means that some parents may think it's high and the kids don't do much at all, whereas other parents think, oh, my kid is not doing this and the kids are doing it. So the point being is that there's actually a lot of work that still needs to be done in fostering communication. Of having parents talk to their kids about what it is actually that they're doing, and educating yourself of what actually is the current en vogue thing. And I think Kara can talk about this a lot because she's done the studies, and as she's doing the studies, she has to change her paradigm because what the kids are doing is changing.
Yeah. And just to piggyback on that point is that parents are talking to their kids and like checking in with their kids too late. So I primarily work with teenagers, and I get asked to speak a lot at high schools about what parents need to do to curb their use when their kids are already 16. At that point, they've sort of missed the boat, right? At age 5, they should be fostering good habits, screen time habits, 3-5 with their kids. As the kids age into getting their own devices, parents need to be talking about responsible use of those devices. So we're really missing the boat, actually, when we're talking about teenagers. We really need to be talking about younger children, too.
And I would say that holds with all sorts of screen time,
Yeah.
even pornography viewing, because there are data out of Poland that the proportion of 6 to 9-year-olds viewing pornography has statistically significantly increased over a 5-year period as compared to the prior 5-year period. So it really, people need to be vigilant, parents need to be vigilant, teachers, and engage children.
Just a related question here. Someone's asking, what's the percentage of adolescents that have a gaming disorder? Do you have an idea of the incidence, prevalence?
Yeah, so a lot of the early prevalence studies use widely differing criteria. And so prevalence estimates range from under 1% to about 50%, depending on where the thresholding occurred. The diagnostic and statistical manual criteria for internet gaming disorder are different from those for gaming disorder as defined by the World Health Organization. But the prevalence estimates depend on the age group and the gender, but they may be around 1% or less for meeting the formal criteria for.
And that includes maladaptive behavior.
So
if you take this out, then you have a bigger percentage, that means.
If you use a less stringent threshold, then you have more people meeting the criteria. People have tended to use very stringent thresholds, a very high bar for behavioral addictions. So for example, for substance use disorders, one needs to meet 2 of 11 criteria. For gaming disorder, internet gaming disorder, one needs to meet 5 of 9 criteria. So the bar is set differently for gaming versus substance use, and that may lead to differences in prevalence estimates where people might minimize the concern about the impact of these conditions.
So another question that may be for you, Marc, is what about the use and education of game-based learning, including videos, competitions, check leaderboards, digital badges? Is that a concern? Could such methods cause harm?
So I think one needs to be mindful of both the positive aspects of digital technologies and the negative aspects. And I think that the internet and related technologies have brought a lot of good things into people's lives. That being said, we do need to be mindful of the problems that may arise in the new environment and understand who might be most vulnerable to developing problems. So as a clinician, that latter part is been a focus of mine. From a public health perspective, I think trying to understand this big range of behaviors and where people fall along, the disordered versus problematic versus at risk versus recreational, low risk versus non-engaging in certain behaviors. We do need to consider all of those levels with respect to internet use and a broad range of internet use behaviors. I think the internet can advance therapeutic approaches in ways that can be very helpful. Digital interventions with respect to reaching people in underserved areas, more rural areas, has significant promise. There are, at our institution, we've been, Kathy Carroll has been developing a computer-based platform for cognitive behavioral therapy. This approach allows people access when they need it, as well as having a more standardized way of delivering the therapy. So there are both good and bad aspects, and we need to evaluate these on a case-by-case basis with respect to the efficacy and utility.
Okay. Advice to new parents. Should there be education, towards directed at new parents as to how to limit use and anything that you think is relevant? Kara, want to start? Since you're a new parent, the newer parent here.
So, yes. So I do think new parents should keep sort of screen time in mind around, again, what types of screen exposure may be good versus maybe less good for kids. I'm not a young child sort of researcher, but again, screen time and screen exposure should not replace activities that one would do with one's child. And so I think that's sort of what to keep foremost. So, like you were saying, if you're going to read to your child, I would not supplant that with a screen. If you're going to take your child outside to play, I would not supplant that with a screen. So I think that is really important to keep in mind. But of course, there are things that are educational. Again, there are things that are age appropriate and age inappropriate, and so things change. Again, as kids age, as to what is appropriate and what may be inappropriate.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, as a pediatrician, I feel like we start these conversations way too late in general. I think a lot of it falls on the pediatrician to start, when the child's born, and then all of a sudden we're talking about feeding and diapering and safe sleep and reading and screen time, and the parents are tired and nobody wants, it's just overwhelming. I personally think we should start these conversations prenatally. We actually did a home visiting based study that we published a couple of years ago where we asked, there was about 280 parents, and they were all from underserved backgrounds, about, this was in the third trimester, was it too early to talk about screen time? And was it too early to talk about reading? And about 96% said it was not too early to talk about reading, and about 80% said it was not too early to start talking about screen time. We followed up that with a home visiting-based assessment at 2 months of how much reading was going on, how much TV was going on in the homes, and we found out that at that point, the good news was about 80% of the parents were reading to their kids, but it was relatively infrequent. But about 68% of 2-month-olds were starting to watch television at that age, and most were about every day. And so these behaviors get ingrained very, very early in terms of routines. You're tuning in with your child in terms of how they like to eat, how they like to sleep, do they like to be read to, and I think television and screen time, really those behaviors start incredibly early. And so we really should be having the conversations with parents, like as we're talking to them about getting the crib ready and getting a plan for feeding, we should also be talking about how we're going to feed the child's brain. What are we going to feed them? Because there's so much confusion about educational television, educational apps, educational everything. It's such a powerful marketing tool that, I think clinicians really do need to use some informed guidance to try to let parents know what are some
what I've always thought that is missing in the pediatric care. It's like you take your children on a regular basis and they get their weight and height and it's good or bad, but they never check their brains. What is going on cognitively or in terms of developmental milestones in terms of just neuropsych or cognitive function. And so that is kind of part of it, regulating uses that could affect that. Do you think that that's a crazy idea?
No, I
think you're looking at
pediatricians are screening people for sure. We screen height and weight and motor skills and language, but I think sometimes what we don't do such a great job about is asking about the contributors to the development of these things.
Okay, well, that takes us into a new, so this question is going to take us into a new direction. Somebody's asking, what are the effects on executive function of, all the screen time and moving from one media to another, etc. But I would like to ask the broader question of, can you comment on effects on cognition? We've talked about brain structure, function, possibly development, addiction, regulating the behavior. But could you comment now on any cognitive aspect of excessive screen use?
Yeah, so I think this is a very important area and one that we've looked at with respect to internet gaming disorder, for example. And we've done studies, brain-based studies and behavioral studies, looking at aspects of, for example, cognitive control. And cognitive control in some models of addiction is an important element where individuals' ability or tendency to exert control over motivational drives to engage in behavior that's often pleasurable, like gaming, an imbalance between these may lead to problematic engagement in gaming or other behaviors. And so a number of our studies suggest that individuals with internet gaming disorder do show impaired cognitive control. And one study looked at the firing and wiring, so the degree to which executive control regions functioned as a coherent group. So the group of individuals with internet gaming disorder showed less functional coherence within an executive control network at a resting state. And this functional coherence was inversely related to the degree of cognitive control on a behavioral task, the Stroop covert interference task. So it suggests that there are these brain mechanisms that are underlying control that are important for internet gaming disorder. And we've seen that during recovery from internet gaming disorder, we followed individuals over the course of a year. We see differences in functional connectivity between cortical and subcortical brain regions, ones that are thought to be particularly relevant to exerting control over motivational drives, that we see changes during the recovery versus the persistence of internet gaming disorder.
So on a more, again, coming back to the ABCD data, because that's basically what we've been looking at, we've been trying to tease that apart. So It's an interesting question of chicken and egg, right? Because are the people that may have certain cognitive predispositions more likely to engage more in screen media, or is screen media resulting in changing in cognitive predispositions or cognitive consequences? It's a very difficult nut to crack, quite frankly, and we did indeed find in the ABCD's data a mild, a very weak relationship between screen media time and cognitive function, in particular crystallized intelligence, which is one part of cognitive function, such that those kids who were more likely to engage in screen media had slightly lower crystallized IQ measurements. But again, this is cross-sectional, so we don't know what is cause and what is effect. We're now beginning to look at this on the longitudinal data, and quite frankly, in the healthy set, again, these are now we're looking at about 11,000 kids, because that's the whole sample. The effects are very weak. We do not see, at least in the first longitudinal data that we're looking at, a very strong effect that if you say out of a sudden you start doing a lot of screen media activity, does that change you, in the sense, does that change your cognitive structure? And we did not see that in the ABCD data so far. It's not to say that it might not be there, but if it's there, it's probably not very strong.
So one of our panelists who is not here today, Dr. Christakis, unfortunately couldn't make it from Seattle. He actually published in 2018 a very interesting study where he used mice and looked at the effect of screen use. It's a very interesting setting where he was bombarding the mice with noise and not stressful noise though, noise and visual stuff, etc. And he showed that there was an effect on cognitive domains, which I just found extremely fascinating. You're aware of this study. You want to comment on this? Do you think that addresses the chicken and the egg question?
Well, I think that these studies are very important because we can, in order to understand these mechanisms, quite frankly, there are certain studies we cannot do in humans, I mean, for obvious reasons. The high standards of causal inference, meaning being able to get to mechanism, is what's called randomized control trials. And that would mean that you basically separate the kids out, and some get, say, a certain amount of screen media, and some other don't, and you see what happens to them. And that's about as close as we can get to causal inference. We don't have that in the human world. And for that very reason, it's really important to have these animal studies, because they can give us some ideas of how this might actually work. At the same time, of course, mice are not little people, right? So there's limitation of the inference of the animal model to the human model. But I do think that this is very important work, and it needs to be followed up with more, so that we can begin to form better explanatory models that we take from the animal world and then test as much as we can in the human world.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, so what are the recommendations for how clinicians should address digital media use in pediatric patients? What public health interventions can improve long-term outcomes pertaining to digital media overuse in children and adolescents?
So the AP guidelines for children there's two sets of them. There's one for younger kids and one for older kids. And for younger children, the guidelines are essentially that at under age about 18 months, and it used to be 2 years, that screen time should really be discouraged. And that's because, for the most part, it's pretty clear that children at that age really do not process screen media very well. They don't learn much from it. They can be engaged by it, they can be enchanted by it, but they're not really getting much out of it. The exception was made for video chat, like if there's a relative overseas, or grandma lives in California, whatever. So in any case, but then for older kids, over 18 months, it's about an hour per day of pro-social viewing, something that's going to be developmentally appropriate. And then other aspects of the guidelines come into content, that it should be age appropriate, nothing too violent, no pornography, for example. And then co-viewing should really be encouraged. One aspect of the guidelines that's not mentioned very often is we should also encourage things that aren't screen time. We should not always just be talking about what kids shouldn't do, but what maybe are some fun things to do. That it's great to read with somebody, it's great to go outside, it's great to interact with people. For adolescents, really the guidelines are pretty similar in terms of the amount of time per day, but the type of content, and there's a lot more emphasis on, social media and, not bullying, not sexting, the kinds of really maladaptive types of media behaviors. Another aspect of the guidelines, I guess, that I didn't mention that's really important is to make sure you pay attention to where the screens are. The bedroom is probably the worst place for a screen to be. Anytime a screen goes into a bedroom, it tends to interfere with sleep, it tends to encourage more viewing, it tends to be harder to police. So that's one aspect of the guidelines. It's pretty universal.
Somebody has raised the issue of whether there are differences between single-player and multiplayer games, because obviously there's more competition, cooperation, and multiplayer games, and whether that has any differential effect on brain development. I guess would that be better than single-player games? Anyone?
So I think this speaks to the complexity of gaming. So there are, as was mentioned, I think the ABCD study has been modifying its questions based on changes in digital technology use. So we've heard about massive multiple online games. There are also online battle arena games, first-person shooter games, and these are all ones that are all involve some aspect of competitive risk-taking. There are also games like Candy Crush arcade games that are a different type of video game that may be more accessible from handheld devices like smartphones. So I think all of these warrant consideration. So with respect to whether this changes cooperation, because this is often a social event, particularly amongst boys, during middle school and high school ages. And children can be ostracized if they're not online engaging in games with their peers. So it's complex for parents to navigate, I would think. And we've done some experiments to try to look at whether engaging in a video game where you are interacting with peers changes cooperative behavior on standardized assessments. So like the chicken game. And what we found was that it does in some cases and doesn't in others. That by engaging in an online video game with a compatriot, that it can in some instances lead to more cooperative behaviors following the gaming as to prior to the gaming. So I think, again, this is a complex area for parents and children to navigate presently.
So we have only about 7 minutes left, and I would like to go through all the questions. So what I would like to do is just have you give very brief answers. Kind of like, I just don't want to have anyone feel left out, that their question didn't make it. So just briefly, 3 to 12-year-old children, is there a maximum hours of screen time per day, and what is the worst time of the day?
So that's the age range where an hour per day is considered to be the maximum according to the AAP, but if you're listening to the AAP. In the World Health Organization, by the way, it's 0 to 5 is screen time should be 0 to 5.
And time of the day?
Time of the day would be turn it off at least an hour before bedtime.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Are there any significant differences among children on the spectrum? I don't know differences in what, but maybe for vulnerability. Quick question, a quick answer. These are children who are spectrum autism, I guess. I mean, they're probably more at risk, right? I would think. Okay. somebody is really worried about people who are programmers, use computers all the time, IT workers. Should we be worried about them? They use screen time all the time. They're on their screens.
On a certain level, screen time can be interpreted like driving. You know, it's like driving isn't inherently dangerous. It sort of depends on how old you are when you're driving, how much you're driving. Are you driving around so much you never get anywhere? Or are you driving for work? You know, it's sort of like in that case, you're driving for work. So, anyway.
I guess this is a medical effects. Are there any effects that you've seen to children's necks and backs from screen time? Has this been an issue?
Yes, it's a clinical issue, and also from gaming with respect to risks, like carpal tunnel types of things.
The other thing where it comes up a lot is vision, and there's definitely a relationship between screen time and myopia, you know, like an increased incidence of nearsightedness, and the reason probably being less about the screen time itself and more about not going outside, you know, where your eyes have evolved to accommodate more. So when you're outside interpreting different distances, then that exercises your eyes in ways that probably influences the shape of your eyeball. But anyway.
I'm sorry?
And obesity.
Okay, a final question here. Is there any way to counteract the detrimental effects of digital media in teens and adolescents if we cannot prevent their use? So counteracting, I guess, you know, are there antidotes?
Go outside, play, interact with people in person. You know, things that people used to do before we had screens.
There are like detox camps now. I mean, there are actually centers, like literally, that I think they started in Washington.
There's one in Washington State.
There's one where parents can send their kids to basically go to rehab for, I mean, that would be the worst case scenario, I think. But yeah, it's always harder to fix something when it's a problem than it is to try to prevent it. So, you know, do our best to prevent
Okay,
it.
well, I hope we got to most of your concerns. I apologize for anything I couldn't read, but I want to thank the panelists for amazing, natural Pam for organizing all this. And her incredible team. Thank you so much.